Jupiter in the second house. Abundant resource. Welcome to Jupiter in the second house in synastry. In this overlay, we explore what happens when one person's Jupiter falls into another person's second house, the house of possessions, livelihood, material resource, and the sense of what one has to draw upon in order to live. This overlay does not announce itself the way Jupiter in the first house does, through immediate impression and personal magnetism. Its register is quieter and more practical. It shows up less in the first electric meeting and more in the gradual accumulating sense that being around this person makes life easier to provide for. Where Jupiter in the first enlarges how someone is seen, Jupiter in the second enlarges what someone has, materially and in their felt sense of sufficiency. As with every Jupiter overlay, the underlying nature of the planet itself sets the terms. Jupiter is the greater benefic, a precise technical designation, not a loose complement, and it operates through increase. It does not cut through obstruction the way Mars does, or apply pressure and form the way Saturn does. It widens. It removes ceilings. At its best, this produces real abundance, real ease, real growth in whatever house it touches. At its most unchecked, the same widening can produce excess, complacency, or a kind of inflated expectation that the world does not actually owe the person carrying it. The second house is a particularly literal stage for this dynamic, because the second house deals in something concrete and countable: money, possessions, resources, the material substance of a life. Jupiter's expansion here is not abstract. It shows up in bank balances, in opportunities, in the sense of having enough, or mishandled, in the illusion of having more than one actually does. The second house, in traditional astrology, governs livelihood and substance, not merely money as an abstraction, but the entire question of resource: what one owns, what one earns, what one can call upon when circumstances require it. It is also closely tied to self-worth in the more grounded sense, not self-worth as performed identity, which belongs more to the first house, but self-worth as the quiet, internal sense that one is provided for, that one's resources are adequate to one's life. Jupiter does not rule the second house in any classical scheme, nor does it rejoice there by the Hellenistic joy doctrine. That distinction belongs to other planets in the traditional House of Joy assignments. But Jupiter's natural signification as the planet of abundance gives it an obvious and powerful sympathy with whatever house governs material substance, even without a formal dignity claim. This is a benefic landing in the house of resource, and that combination, dignity aside, tends to behave generously. From the Jupiter person's perspective, there is often a genuine and somewhat instinctive generosity directed toward the house person's material life. The Jupiter person may find themselves wanting to contribute, practically, financially, or simply through the kind of optimism that makes the house person's resources feel less precarious. This is not necessarily about grand gestures. It can be as simple as the Jupiter person's presence making questions of money and security feel less anxious, less scarce, more workable than they did before. The Jupiter person tends to see the house person's potential for material stability and growth, and often acts, consciously or not, as an agent of that growth, whether through direct support, useful connections, or simply a contagious confidence about what is possible. From the house person's perspective, the experience is frequently one of relief. Jupiter lands on the house of resource, and resource begins to feel less constrained. The house person may notice that opportunities related to income, possessions, or material security seem to open up around the relationship, not always through anything the Jupiter person does directly, but through the general expansion of possibility that Jupiter's presence tends to generate. There is often a felt sense of being provided for, or at least of provision being more available than it was before, which can translate into a deeper and more settled sense of self-worth. When one's material foundation feels more secure, the anxious calculations of daily survival recede, and something steadier becomes possible underneath them. At its most constructive, This overlay produces real material benefit and a genuine deepening of the house person's sense of worth and sufficiency. The relationship carries a practical generosity, gifts given without resentment, resources shared without keeping score, a mutual sense that abundance is something to be circulated rather than hoarded. The Jupiter person's instinct toward generosity finds, in the house person, a legitimate and appreciative recipient, which gives that instinct purpose rather than letting it remain diffuse. The house person, meanwhile, may find that their relationship to money and possession becomes less anxious and more expansive, not because their actual resources have necessarily multiplied, but because their felt relationship to scarcity has loosened. There is also a particular flavor of trust that tends to develop in this overlay, a confidence on the house person's part that the material dimension of the relationship is fundamentally safe. Money is one of the most common sources of friction between people, and a Jupiter overlay into the second house tends to soften that friction considerably. Where other configurations might generate tension or competitiveness around resource, this one tends toward shared abundance, a sense that there is, between these two people, more than enough to go around. And yet, as with every Jupiter placement, the expansive gift carries a shadow that deserves direct treatment rather than polite omission. The second house is where Jupiter's tendency toward excess becomes most literally financial. The same generosity that feels like relief can, unchecked, tip into overspending, overextension, or a complacent relationship to resource that assumes abundance will simply continue without the discipline required to sustain it. Jupiter expands. It does not by itself budget. A relationship under this overlay can develop a shared appetite for more spending, more acquisition, more material comfort, that outpaces what either person's actual circumstances can responsibly support. There is also a subtler risk around the house person's sense of self-worth. If the house person's felt sufficiency becomes too closely tied to the Jupiter person's presence or generosity, a kind of dependency can develop, not necessarily financial dependency in a literal sense, though that is possible too, but an emotional dependency in which the house person's basic sense of having enough becomes contingent on the relationship continuing in its current, generous form. Jupiter's gift of ease can, if the house person is not careful, quietly substitute for the harder and more durable work of building one's own independent relationship to resource and self-worth. There is a further pattern worth naming. Jupiter's optimism does not always distinguish between resources that are genuinely available and resources that merely feel available because the relationship has made scarcity less psychologically present. A couple under this overlay may find themselves making material decisions, spending, investing, committing, on the strength of a felt abundance that has not been honestly tested against their actual joint or individual circumstances. The correction, when it comes, can feel disproportionately harsh precisely because the overlay's optimism made the warning signs easy to overlook. The distinction between the nourishing and the inflating expressions of this placement tends to rest on whether the abundance it generates is met with honest accounting. Jupiter's nature is to expand the sense of what is possible. It is not, by itself, equipped to verify whether that sense is accurate. When the Jupiter person's generosity and the house person's growing sense of sufficiency are both grounded in a clear and honest view of actual resources, this overlay produces durable material and emotional benefit. When that honesty is absent, when the relationship simply feels abundant without anyone checking whether it is, the same overlay can produce a comfortable drift toward overextension that eventually requires a more painful reckoning. At its highest expression, Jupiter in the second house creates a relationship marked by genuine material generosity, a shared and settled sense of sufficiency, and a softening of one of the more common sources of relational friction. The Jupiter person's instinct to provide and expand finds, in the house person, a worthy and appreciative object. The house person's sense of self-worth deepens not through performance, but through the quiet, accumulating experience of being materially and emotionally provided for. When balanced, Jupiter in the second house creates material ease, deepened self-worth, generous and unresentful resource sharing, and a relationship in which abundance feels mutual rather than contested. When imbalanced, it can produce overspending, complacency, a borrowed and untested sense of sufficiency, and a quiet dependency in which one's basic sense of having enough becomes tied to a relationship rather than to one's own grounded resourcefulness. At its core, this overlay is about the experience of feeling materially and personally more sufficient in someone else's company, less anxious about resource, more able to imagine and pursue genuine abundance. The question it poses, and that only the two people involved can answer, is whether that sufficiency is being built on an honest foundation, or whether it is, for now, simply the comfortable and untested feeling of more.
This was Jupiter in the second house in Synastry Overlays. Thank you for listening. Next, Jupiter in the third house.